The 400-year curse people keep talking about may have already ended. And if that is true, then everything changes. Because now the question is no longer when things will change. The question is why so many things still feel the same. Why does the struggle still feel familiar? Why does effort still feel like it does not always produce ownership? Why do people work, build, sacrifice, survive, and still feel like they are living inside the same pattern? Because maybe the part people were waiting on was never just a date. Maybe the deeper issue was never only time. Maybe the question was not just when the 400 years would end. Maybe the real question was what happens when the time ends but the pattern remains. When people talk about the 400-year curse, they usually connect it to Scripture, especially Deuteronomy 28, where the Bible lays out blessings for obedience and consequences for disobedience. And when those consequences get connected to history, people often connect them to Genesis 15, where Scripture speaks of a people being strangers in a land that was not theirs, afflicted for 400 years. And when that timeline gets connected to history, it usually points to one year, 1619. The year a ship called the White Lion arrived at Point Comfort in present-day Hampton, Virginia. But what most people do not realize is that the White Lion was not simply on a planned mission to Virginia. It did not arrive there like a normal trading ship following a clean path across the ocean. It ended up there after violence, conflict, interception, and exploitation had already taken place far out in the Atlantic world. Before that ship reached Virginia, the story was already about power. It was already about control. It was already about people being treated as property before they ever touched that shore. Out in the Atlantic, a Portuguese slave ship was carrying Africans taken from West Central Africa, from regions connected to what is now Angola. They were already in captivity, already forced into a system that looked at human beings and saw profit, already moving through a world where nations, ships, merchants, and privateers were fighting over wealth, land, influence, and resources. Then that ship was intercepted. English privateers, including the White Lion and the treasurer, attacked and seized some of the Africans on board. They were not taken as passengers. They were not rescued into freedom. They were taken again, taken once from their land, then taken again at sea. And that tells you something about how the system worked. It did not just steal bodies. It transferred ownership. It moved people from one hand to another, from one power to another, from one system of control into the next. The White Lion carried some of them to Virginia, where they were exchanged for food, supplies, and resources. So when that ship arrived in 1619, it was not just a ship reaching land. It was the result of decisions, the result of violence, the result of greed, the result of a system that had already decided that human life could be measured by what someone else could gain from it. And over time, that moment became symbolic, because many people began connecting 1619 to those 400 years mentioned in Scripture. The beginning of affliction, the beginning of generational consequence, the beginning of something that would shape families, labor, ownership, identity, faith, and survival for centuries. So if you follow that timeline from 1619 to 2019, that is 400 years. And because of that, many people expected something to shift. Some expected life to suddenly feel different. Some expected conditions to change. Some expected struggle to break. Some expected the atmosphere itself to feel lighter. But that is where most people stop thinking. Because time can end, but a pattern does not end just because the calendar moves. A date can pass, but behavior can remain. A season can close, but identity can still be shaped by what the season produced. And that is where this becomes personal. Because if the 400 years ended, but life still feels the same, then maybe the issue is not whether the time ended. Maybe the issue is whether the pattern was ever interrupted. Because time ending does not automatically change people. Time does not reprogram habits. Time does not restore values. Time does not rebuild identity. Time does not renew the mind. Time does not automatically return a person back to God. And if nothing changes internally, then the outside can still feel the same. That is why even after a timeline ends, the experience can still feel familiar. Because what people are dealing with is not only history, it is repetition. And repetition is powerful. What gets repeated gets reinforced. What gets reinforced becomes normal. And what becomes normal starts to feel permanent, even when it is not. That is how patterns take hold. Not always through one dramatic moment, but slowly, day after day, choice after choice, habit after habit, influence after influence. Until people are not just living in the pattern anymore, they start identifying with it. And once a person identifies with a pattern, they stop questioning it. They stop challenging it. They stop imagining anything beyond it. Because it no longer feels like something they learned. It feels like who they are. And if you look at life honestly, you can see the pattern everywhere. You work, but it never feels like enough. You earn, but it disappears just as fast. You build, but you do not always get to enjoy what you built. You give time, but the return does not always match the sacrifice. You move all day, but do not always feel like you are moving forward. But the pattern is not only financial, it is not only historical, it is not only external, it also shows up in attention. Think about the beginning of your day. Before you even fully wake up, before you pray, before you think clearly, before your mind has direction, your attention already belongs to something else. The phone is right there. Notifications, messages, scrolling, noise, opinions, fear, comparison, entertainment, distraction. And before your day even begins, your mind has already been pulled in 10 different directions. That is not just distraction, that is replacement. Because in Scripture, one of the reasons judgment came was not only disobedience, it was idolatry. Placing something above God, giving priority, attention, trust, desire, and devotion to something else. And today idolatry does not always look like statues. Sometimes it looks like what you check first, what you listen to most, what shapes your mood, what directs your thoughts, what captures your focus before God ever gets your attention. Because whatever has your attention is shaping your direction. And whatever shapes your direction is shaping your life. So if your day starts with everything else before God, then something else is leading. And that is where the battle becomes deeper. Because Scripture does not only talk about disobedience, it also talks about influence. And influence is not always loud. Sometimes influence is subtle. Sometimes it looks normal. Sometimes it looks harmless. Sometimes it looks like entertainment. Sometimes it looks like keeping up. Sometimes it looks like just checking your phone for a second. But little by little, attention shifts. And when attention shifts, direction shifts. And when direction shifts, life follows. That is why the battle is not only something that happened in the past. The battle is happening right now. Not just around you, but within you. Not just through systems, but through choices. Not just through history, but through influence. Because even if something ended, that does not mean the struggle ended. You are not just dealing with patterns. You are dealing with voices. Some voices pull you toward discipline. Some pull you toward distraction. Some pull you toward God. Some pull you toward everything that keeps you away from Him. And every day, whether you notice it or not, you are choosing which voice gets authority. The battle is not only happening around you, the battle is happening within you, through attention, through habits, through repetition, through what you normalize, through what you feed your mind every single day. because little by little, whatever consistently shapes your attention eventually starts shaping your identity. And once something shapes your identity long enough, it starts shaping your life. That is why the real battle is deeper than most people realize. It is not only about what happened historically, it is about what is still being repeated internally, because patterns do not survive through time alone. They survive through reinforcement, through repetition, through influence, through agreement. And every single day, whether consciously or unconsciously, people continue feeding something. Discipline or distraction, truth or comfort, growth or escape, direction or confusion. And eventually, whatever voice keeps getting fed becomes the voice that leads. And that is why part one cannot end with a simple answer. Because the deeper question is not only what happened to people 400 years ago, the deeper question is what pattern is still being repeated now, what influence is still shaping the mind, what voice is still leading the day, what identity is still being built through repeated choices. Because if the pattern was never interrupted, then the next question becomes the one most people avoid. How does a pattern become who you are? And how do you finally break it? In part two, we are going deeper into the pattern itself, how habits become identity, how attention shapes direction, how values and beliefs either pull people closer to God or keep them trapped in the same cycle. Because the curse may not continue through time, it continues through repetition, and what repeats will remain until someone finally interrupts the pattern. Part two changes everything. Subscribe to Hidden Lineage.